One of the biggest mistakes all weight loss diets and plans make is assuming that eating is just eating and all you need to do is to do less of it. It's not the case. Eating a piece of birthday cake with friends is not the same as autopilot eating cake to relieve agitation. Yet most weight loss advice treats every mouthful of food as though it belongs in exactly the same category. Today I want to show you how that hinders weight loss efforts. Because when all eating gets lumped together, the explanations become simplistic, the solutions become narrow, and women end up blaming themselves for behaviours they don't understand. The 4 layers behind weight regain offers a different way of seeing eating, one that explains why some behaviours respond to willpower and others never will. Listen in. Hi there, it's Bronwyn. Welcome back to Before Dieting. Of the many reasons I started this podcast, the main one was to introduce new ways of seeing weight regain. Because if we keep looking at the problem through the same lens, we'll keep arriving at the same explanations and the same solutions. And one of the challenges with any complex problem is that the language we already have is often not adequate to describe what's happening. If the only explanation we have for weight regain is I eat too much or I need more willpower, then every solution starts looking the same. We keep returning to the calories, the discipline, the self-control, because we don't have any other ways of seeing the problem. And that's why new concepts matter. So terms you will hear about today, like food rules and food stories and eating blueprints, give us new reference points. They help us separate things that previously looked like one big tangled mess, and they allow us to see structure instead of personal failure. We also need new ways to visualize and organize the problem, because the moment you can see eating as layers instead of one undifferentiated behavior, then new explanations do become possible. What looked like a lack of discipline might turn out to be a food story, or what looked like binging is most likely an eating system taking down the emotional temperature. But the most important reason to have new concepts and language is to stop the paralyzing effects of self-blame and shame. When we can move beyond blame and shame, we stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what's happening here. That's the question that opens inquiry, and inquiry is where new reasons and solutions emerge. In last week's episode, we talked about boundaries, the systems thinking kind, and how expanding the frame around your eating can change the entire view of what you're looking at. Once you stop focusing only on the calories in, calories out, you can start including the rest of your life. And then when you can do that, the behaviour that once felt confusing starts to reorganise itself. And as I said last week, it's not that the woman has changed, but the frame of reference has. So today, I want to take you further into that expanded frame, because once you widen the boundary, the next question becomes, where do we look now? So when it comes to eating, what we need to look at is what is the structure that sits underneath it. One of the most common things women tell me is that some parts of their eating feel easy to shift, while other parts feel immovable. They might be able to adjust breakfast without much effort, but the evening pattern refuses to budge. Or they can follow an eating plan for a while, but something deeper eventually overrides it. That contrast isn't a mystery. It's a clue that eating doesn't sit all on one level. It sits on several. And from that 1,000 conversations I had with women who were experiencing weight regain, 4 distinct layers started to emerge. And these layers explain why some behaviours respond to conscious effort and others seem to operate on a different plane entirely. So I'd like you to think of today's episode as a map or a way of orienting yourself once you step beyond the calories only view. So as I said, there are 4 layers that I've seen. Let's start with the surface layer, or the one that I've called food rules. These are the surface level instructions. And food rules are the simplest layer. They are instructions we've absorbed long before we ever thought about how to eat. And these rules were learned at the childhood dinner table. To give you an example, let me introduce you to Mara. She grew up in a household where the expectation around food was clear. You finish what you were given. Her parents had lived through periods where food was scarce and finishing your plate wasn't about manners, it was about respect and gratitude. She didn't question it, she absorbed it the way children absorb everything, through consistent meal by meal reinforcement. These rules don't involve discussion. These are the do as you're told rules. So track forward years later when she's out to dinner with friends. She's full, she knows she's full, but the idea of leaving food behind makes her uneasy. Now, she doesn't think of it as a rule. It simply feels like the right thing to do, to finish what's on a plate. And that's the nature of food rules. They're familiar, they're automatic, and they feel normal. But they do influence what, when, and how much you eat. But they don't explain the behaviour. They only describe it. And if you've ever tried to solve overeating by adding more food rules, you already know how limited this layer is. So rules tell you what someone does, but they tell you nothing about why they do it. So let's go another layer deeper. At layer 2 sits the food stories. This layer explains the emotional logic beneath those rules that you learned. Food stories are where the food rules are given their power. They're the experiences that gave rise to the rules in the first place. So let me give you an example from Lena. And Lena has a habit of accepting food whenever it's offered. She doesn't think about it as a habit, it feels more like a courtesy. But when she talks about her childhood, the story becomes clearer. Her grandmother expressed love through food. So declining a biscuit wasn't just declining a snack, it was about declining the relationship. So Lena learned early that accepting food was a way of maintaining connection. So the rule says accept the food when you're offered. The food story says this is how you show love. So it's food stories that attach meaning to behaviour. They explain why a woman feels pressure to finish her plate, or why leaving food behind feels uncomfortable, or even why refusing foods feels like a small betrayal. And once a story attaches itself to a food rule, the behaviour becomes more persistent. You're no longer responding to an instruction alone, you're responding to the emotional logic behind it. But even this doesn't explain everything, because many women understand their food stories and still find themselves eating in ways that feel outside their control. So that means we need to go another layer deeper. Let's go down to the eating blueprint, or the default map. So if food rules are the instructions and food stories are the emotional logic behind them, the eating blueprint is the map your brain uses to navigate everyday eating. So let me tell you how Sophie saw this. Sophie has a pattern she can describe in detail. She eats very little during the day because she likes the feeling of being on track. And then when she gets home from work, she of course gravitates towards the kitchen. So she's got part hunger, part craving, part habit that have all come together to form a pattern that she's been following for years. So this is blueprint behaviour. It's efficient, it's semi-automatic, and it feels normal. The blueprint includes routines, expectations, preferences, and even the small decisions all accumulate into a pattern. It's where your usual breakfast lives, or your tendency to want something sweet after dinner, and maybe even your habit of eating before a social event or waiting until you get home. The blueprint can be changed. It has some flexibility. It can respond to conscious effort. But within the blueprint sits something different entirely. Something that doesn't respond to decisions or rules or good intentions. And this is where the deepest layer lives. And at level 4 is the eating system, something that runs on deep autopilot. This is the layer most women have never been taught to recognise. It's also the layer that feels the most bewildering. It's the one that makes a woman say, I don't know what happened, I was doing fine, and then I was blindsided by eating out of control. So let's meet Ruth. Ruth is organised. She's a planner, and that planning extends to what she eats and how much. But on a regular basis, she says her eating is totally out of control. It's always at night and when she's alone. She describes it as inhaling anything sweet as though she is possessed. She can't get enough sweet stuff in fast enough to get rid of the agitation that she feels. And of course, what she's describing here is relief eating. And for her, eating sweet things is the quickest way to get relief. So what is this eating system? Well, it's a specialised function that sits within the eating blueprint that activates under specific conditions. Emotional intensity is one and calorie restriction is another. When the eating system switches on, it produces a response designed to resolve emotional agitation. And relief eating is the mechanism it uses to do that. Relief eating isn't about enjoyment. It's about ending the high level of emotion or agitation. And here's the key point. An eating system doesn't respond to willpower. Once it's activated, the system follows its own internal logic. And that is why so many women say, I was doing the right thing and then it all unraveled. They didn't lose control. Their eating system activated and it did exactly what it was designed to do. And this is where the dieting paradox appears, because the very tool women are told to use, calorie restriction, is one of the most common triggers for activating this deep stabilization system. It's not that you failed a diet. The diet itself will trigger the eating system that produces relief eating. So let me sum up how these 4 layers fit together. Food rules are the visible instructions. Food stories explain where those instructions came from. The blueprint is the larger pattern created by rules, the stories, preferences, and repeated ways of managing eating. But the eating system is the specialized function that activates under pressure and uses relief eating to restore equilibrium. Look, if you can take on these 4 layers as a new way to look at this, then the landscape of eating looks very different. Because once you understand it in this context, you can stop trying to solve an eating system with more diet rules. It doesn't work. You can stop assuming that every eating pattern is a discipline problem. It's not. And you can stop blaming yourself for behaviours that are running on autopilot. When you can identify the layer that you're looking at, the behaviour often starts to make sense. And once it makes sense, then matching solutions start to appear. And they're not always calorie restriction. If you'd like a copy of the 4 layers model, you can download it from my website. I've put the link in the show notes. And if today's episode helped you see eating in a new way, please leave a rating or review. It will help other women find this work, and then we can all step out of the shame-based explanations. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk with you next week.